Good evening and welcome to the Linnaean Society, where Darwin's revolutionary paper on natural selection was read for the first time. The occasion passed without much notice. Well, the BBC has certainly remedied that. Tonight we examine what Darwin's theories tell us about ourselves. I'm joined by an international panel of pinnacles of evolution. Professor Steven Pinker, psychologist from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Professor Meredith Small, anthropologist from Cornell University. Professor Steve Jones, biologist from University College London, and Dr. Jonathan Miller, neurologist and polymath. The issue tonight is, to what extent are we still under the shadow of natural selection? We're not concentrating on grand theories, but how far does evolution make its way into everyday life? Evolution is about success in reproduction and survival, so let's start with human reproduction. To what extent are our sexual desires determined by our evolutionary inheritance? Steven Pinker.
Well, I don't think people have sex for evolutionary reasons. They're not interested in propagating their genes. If they were, there'd be no such thing as contraception. On the other hand, if you ask the question, why is there sexual desire to begin with? Why do people get pleasure out of sex? I think evolution has everything to do with it. The fact that people would rather have sex than, say, bump foreheads or rub an elbow against a knee surely is related to the fact that sex leads to reproduction, whereas those other activities don't. More subtly, I think that there are a number of features of sexuality that can be explained on the assumption that it is a way of sending genes into the next generation. The fact that people are attracted to other people who look as if they're fertile, who have the right body shape and size and the right age. The fact that there are...
So is it men attracted to, from your book, men attracted to particular sort of women and vice versa?
And the difference between the sexes. In all societies, male sexuality and female sexuality are not equivalent. Roughly speaking, men have more of a tendency to go for quantity, women for quality, and it's surely no coincidence that a man who has sex with 50 women can have 50 times as many children. A woman who has sex with 50 men is not going to have 50 times as many children. So that biological fact and that behavioral fact presumably are related, and that's an example of how evolutionary theory helps explain some of the patterns of human sexual desire.
Would you go along with that, Steve?
Yes, I think so far so self-evident, really. I mean, I don't think we need Charles Darwin to tell us that old men need like young women, and not necessarily the other way around. We did evolve, of course we evolved, and our lives are constrained by our past. But to say that actually isn't to say much more than to say that the reason pigs can't fly is that they descended from ancestors who didn't have wings. Now, that's true, but it's not a very profound thing to say. And I do think there's been a terrible tendency in this debate about sexuality and many other things to overinterpret the obvious. So I think we should realize that we're unique in that, although we have evolved, what's interesting about us has really stepped outside Darwin's theory. We've escaped from evolution in sex and many other things too.
Meredith Small.
Well, I'd just like to add that what humans do and what they say are two different things. So men may desire younger women, but in fact research shows that couples are made up of individuals that are about 3 years apart. Women may want men of high status or a lot of money, but pretty much we end up with who loves us or who wants us. So the desires can be very different from the actual fact of who you reproduce with.
Jonathan Miller.
And social class might also have something to do with it. I mean, it's quite clear that there must be some evolutionary explanation for the fact that pleasure is attached to this activity for which one otherwise might have to put an entry in one's diary to remind one to do it. And whenever pleasure is attached to a labor-intensive activity, it must be that there must at one time have been a selective advantage in doing it, and therefore some sort of selective advantage in attaching pleasure to it. But I think that there's, as Steve was saying, I think there probably is not much more to it than that we can say. What is interesting are the enormous varieties of human behavior which lie outside these biases. I mean, there must be some sort of bias which is genetically determined, which means that we still go on having sex. But also what is interesting about us is the enormous variety of our sexual conduct, which really has no effect on the amount of genes that we push into the next generation and beyond.
Steve?
I think that Steve wasn't quite being fair in saying that this is all just obvious and we don't need evolution to tell us this. It's obvious now because of the evolutionary theory that had become well known 20 years ago. But up till then, and indeed today, at present times, there are many people who say that men's desire for a variety of sexual partners is just due to the influence of James Bond and is a culturally local phenomenon and wouldn't be found in other cultures, which turns out to be false. Many people would say that with the feminist revolution, that asymmetry will vanish, and recent studies have shown that it has not vanished. Similarly, the study of the correlation between tastes for sexually attractive bodies and fertility would not have been dreamed of without the Darwinian analysis. Even a few years ago, people would have said, well, you can't quantify beauty. It varies capriciously from culture to culture, and it has nothing to do with biology.
Can I bring in Meredith Small here? Because something that Stephen Pinker said on the way through implied that men were necessarily more promiscuous than women. And in your book, insofar as I read it correctly, that's one of the points you take on, don't you?
Yes, work by Robin Baker has highlighted several biological features of women that suggest that women may be designed to be interested in multiple partners. And we can't just say this is a provenience of males, and it may be the heavy hand of culture that stops women, and in various cultures, from having multiple partners. And again, what women say they like or say what they're doing and what they're really doing are two different things.
What do you think about this basic? Is there a basic difference?
Well, there must be some sort of biological bias. I mean, it's like the bias that exists in a bowl. And there are these genes which constitute the bias, and they turn things in certain directions. And the directions you've mentioned, and the particular sort of partners that are favoured. The fact that sexual activity is undertaken at all with the sort of energy and expenditure that it is indicates that it must be biologically determined in some way.
Well, is it biologically determined? Because what Meredith Small has been saying is, look, this is culturally determined. Women have been given a subservient role in many cultures, and they've even been given a subservient role, if you forgive the pun, in sex.
Why do we have to be exclusive about it? I mean, the whole point of it is that we are, in fact, these amphibious creatures distributed halfway between a culture which is best described in cultural terms and our genetic inheritance, which is best described in genetic terms. It somehow always comes down to some sort of ideological struggle in which you have to choose partners, and you have to decide whether you're going to be a biologist or whether you're going to be a cultural analyst. Now, some people say that it's absurd and sort of limp-wristed and hand-waving to use cultural analysis, and that finally that the biological truths are the only ones which can be tested, and therefore the only ones which can possibly be true in any interesting way. And this is rank nonsense. I mean, it's quite clear that there is a sort of anamorphic distortion of something which in animals is determined entirely genetically, because it's refracted through a very complicated medium of culture which actually spreads the beam of genetic effects across a very, very wide area, which simply doesn't occur with animals that don't have the sort of developing culture that we have.
Do you think that pair bonding, which you again have written about, is something that is essential in the evolution of Homo sapiens sapiens as is happening now?
The answer is sort of interesting, because I used to believe that. I used to make the statement that pair bonding in humans is as hardwired as bipedalism. And then in an audience much like this, standing up, making that statement, I had a social anthropologist very kindly correct me, saying that in the people that she studies in South America, although they are married and they do have sex, they lead completely separate lives. They have different friends, they don't sleep in the same bed, they don't eat meals together. They are not what we would consider in Western culture pair bonded. So it calls to question, are we naturally pair bonded? My first reaction is yes, we always like to find someone to be with, but perhaps that's not a universal feature of humans.
Do you think pair bonding is an evolutionary development, Steve Jones?
I think in a broader sense, yes. I mean, given that we have infants who are tremendously dependent, I think the argument that it's necessary to have two individuals looking after that infant...
Three is better.
Three is even better.
Or four.
Yeah. Probably has some weight, yes. I mean, I don't think, as Jonathan Miller says, I think it's silly to deny the involvement of evolution and genetics in things like pair bonding. I don't think any of us do. We're much less pair bonded than, say, the kittiwake is, that nice little bird that flies around. But to know that doesn't, alter my attitude towards human behaviour very much. It's also the case, if you look...
Well, the attitude to human behaviour is... Our society for a long time, and still is, was based on pair bonding being the absolute, being the given. This is what people must do. It wasn't only the ideal, it was the compelled ideal if you're going to produce children. That has begun to break down quite spectacularly recently, hasn't it?
It depended on social class. I mean, no one ever talks about the biology of nannies. and about the fact that large groups of society actually use a third person to do most of the caring and bonding indeed. And in fact, in aristocratic families and people who have enough money, the child is bonded much more to the nanny than it is to the biological mother. Now, the fact is that a cultural analysis is required in order to explain the differences in various communities that decide to live together in certain ways, rear their children in certain ways, distribute the care of children in certain ways, and it's a cultural matter and not a biological one.
Well, on the other hand, is there anything, taking what Jonathan says on board, is there anything about our evolutionary past that indicates the way that we are going in the business of living together to produce children? Are we going to live together to produce children and then separate, or is there anything along the way of the last few thousand years?
Well, I think the key thing is to acknowledge the role of culture, but not to treat it as some autonomous force, some surrounding gas or some force like gravity that just magically causes people to behave. That culture is itself a set of neural mechanisms, a set of biases to pay attention to some things and not others, to draw certain conclusions from other people's behavior and not others, and that changing social structures come from shifting opportunities, probably given a constant set of human desires. So there is a desire for sex, there's a desire to have your babies survive and do well, there's also a desire not to do more work than you have to do. If you're in a society where you can achieve all three of them at the same time by hiring nannies or slaves or as whatever is available, then you'll have a different social structure. But those different social structures aren't really in opposition to the idea that we have an evolved psychology. It's simply that the same set of emotions can be manifested in different ways depending on the situation of others around us.
Steve Jones.
There's a problem with this kind of argument, which is that it becomes a sort of anti-science, and the evolution then becomes like a sofa which molds itself to the buttocks of anybody who happens to sit on it. So what you've now got is a situation where you can explain all conceivable patterns of human behavior in evolutionary terms, and that means that you no longer have an experiment to do, an observation to make, which could disprove it. I mean, I read the other day, to my astonishment, that by the year 2010, more than half of all mothers in Britain will be stepmothers. So they will not be genetically related to the children they're looking after. Now, I haven't yet heard the evolutionary explanation of that shows it to be moulded by natural selection, but I'm well aware that within a few weeks or a few months there will be a completely seamless explanation of it. And we're turning really not into evolutionists, but into theologians. We have this wonderful book.
No, I disagree with that, yeah. Because there's more than one outcome that's compatible with evolutionary theory doesn't mean that any outcome is. And I could give you any number that would just falsify the theory outright. If there was a society in which people were completely unconcerned about genealogy, if after several women gave birth, you could just randomly switch the babies around and mothers wouldn't care that they were raising theirs as opposed to someone else, I would say that refutes the theory.
Well, half of all mothers being stepmothers is getting some way along that road.
However, there's another prediction there, that step relationships should not be equivalent to biological relationships psychologically, and indeed they're not. Daly and Wilson, testing a hypothesis that no one else had thought to look at, again on the basis of evolutionary theory, compared rates of child abuse for natural parents versus biological parents versus step parents, and found enormous differences.
100 to 1, wasn't it?
100 to 1.
Step mothers were 100 to 1 more likely to kill, actually, the children.
In the most extreme case. And indeed, the whole psychology of reconstituted families is one of how to cope with the antagonisms between stepchildren and step-parents. That's what the self-help industry on step-parenting is about. That's what the psychologists have to deal with when they see these people. So indeed, it's a prediction that could have gone the other way. It could be that people were completely indifferent to whether a child is theirs or not. That's not the way we're constituted.
There will be a feeling on a lot of people watching this program that evolution drives society forward fundamentally by creating more children to drive society forward, fundamentally to create more children to drive society forward. That's around in some people's minds. Now, one thing that gets in the way of that, and we've talked about, is contraception. Another is the question of homosexuality.
Male homosexuality is around. It's always been around. The standard explanation, which was touted around, was that it had evolved because male homosexualities were a bit like helpers in in a bird colony or in a beehive, because they helped, although they themselves didn't reproduce, perhaps they were altruistic and they helped other people to reproduce. Well, that's a very nice idea, but there is precisely zero evidence that it's true. And it seems to, nevertheless, it's come into the culture as an explanation of male homosexuality. We don't know the answer, I think, as to what homosexuality evolved. It may not be a phenomenon in its own right at all. I mean, it's a sort of epiphenomenon from sexual drive. I'm always reminded of the supposed rule in the British Navy in the 18th century that homosexuality was a hanging offence at sea until the ship had been out of port for 23 days, whereupon it became completely legal. So, you know, it's a culturally constructed thing. There may be some biology down there somewhere, but we don't need to explain every detail with Mendel and Darwin. We can't.
Do you agree with that?
And it may not even be one thing. That the idea that homosexuality is identifiable as simply the choice of people who have the same gender actually simplifies a situation which may, in fact, it may be a very complicated, multifactorial issue altogether.
Part of the human sexual continuum.
Yes.
I think more can be said, though. I mean, I don't disagree with anything that's been said here, but for one thing, I mean, the overwhelming fact is that the vast majority of people are not exclusively homosexual, perhaps 3% of men and a smaller percentage of women. So the simplest evolutionary analysis correctly accounts for more than 97% of the data, which is a far better batting average than most theories in psychology. But even for that 3%, we know that we have good reason to believe that the E.O. Wilson's hypothesis of the helper at the nest is just false. I mean, it made an empirical prediction. The empirical prediction is wrong, so we can dispense with that theory. But there is an alternative that recently came out of the lab of Dean Hamer, the one who identified a chromosomal marker that's associated with a subset of homosexual men. The question there is, why would even that gene not have been selected out years before? And the marker is on the X chromosome. Now, women have 2 X chromosomes, men have 1, which means if you take the gene's eye view, that gene will find itself in female bodies twice as often as in male bodies, which means that it could, in theory, be selected for if the benefit that it brings to women is half the cost that it brings in men. He said, why don't you test the effect of this gene when it's in women, in the relatives of these men? The prediction is that they should have higher fertility. The prediction seems to be confirmed. Now, this story may or may not pan out upon successive replications, but it's an interesting case where a fairly subtle aspect of evolutionary theory, in particular the selfish gene variant, led to a surprising empirical prediction that looks like it's being confirmed.
Well, I mean, there is the embarrassing practical problem that the Dean Hamer finding of the so-called gay gene has been withdrawn. It was looked for, not found again, which is nothing. There's nothing.
It wasn't reconfirmed.
It wasn't reconfirmed.
A book that just came out last week. He is not withdrawn it.
Last week, I missed it. It's not out here yet.
Are you saying that? Would you agree then? Would you agree, Meredith, that culture has been shaped in any way by natural selection?
Well, I think the ability to be a cultural creature is certainly shaped by natural selection.
Can you tell us how you think that is?
Cognitively, to be able to take in information and process it, make a decision, be a conscious individual. But we have to remember we're not the only ones that have culture. Chimpanzees have culture. They even have multiculturalism, where there are particular behaviors that chimps at one location will do, say nut cracking when they're smacking open nuts and eating them, and in another location, the nuts are there, the rocks are there to do it, and the chimps do not do that behavior. And there's a list of cultural behaviors that different chimps do. So we can't just say we're the only ones that are cultural creatures. There's evidence that the biological basis of being cultural is in our heritage.
How would you put culture and natural selection together, Stephen Pinker?
Certainly, natural selection by itself isn't going to predict the historical development of cultures. It's not going to explain why the Scottish are different from the English, or why why Darwin was different from Wallace. On the other hand, I think it has a role to play, not in predicting down to the individual choice of the individual person in a given place and time what he or she is going to do, but in talking about the recurring elements of human nature that go into making a culture. Some of them are cognitive, some of them are linguistic, the fact that our species has the ability to acquire a language. Some of them are emotional, the fact that all people in all times and places are going to have a fairly short list of basic desires, and that cultures are going to be set up so that the people who control the cultures are going to satisfy those desires.
But do you think there are aspects of culture which do link in more, or can be demonstrated as having more to do with natural selection than others? In one of your books you talk about landscape painting tapping into a particular part of the brain. Could you develop that?
Yeah, certainly many of the things that you see in the most universal forms of art, not high art, which almost by definition resists easy analysis, the kind of things that the paintings that people hang on their walls, the music that people buy by the millions and so on, many of those tastes can, I think, have a systematic relationship to what our species evolved. One of them is a preference for landscapes. All over the world, people like green space. They like to look at animals and flowers and trees and bodies of water. It's probably not a coincidence that this coincides with an optimal habitat for Homo sapiens, as opposed to, say, barren Nevada, featureless desert, or thick rainforest. And so some of the psychological basis of aesthetics, what people simply find pleasing, I think can be systematically explained by evolutionary history.
There is a counter-argument to that, which also doesn't get explained. It's perfectly true that there must be some sort of biological determinant which explains favouring what seem to be ecologically hospitable landscapes. But why is it that, for example, for nearly 1,000 years, mountain landscapes were regarded as truly repulsive, which would fit in with your theory? And then quite suddenly we get to the theory of the sublime, as put forward by Burke, in which cavernous crevasses and high, infertile mountains became the height of the romantic imagination. It was the epitome of the beautiful and the awesome. Now, are you simply going to brush aside these exceptions, these quite revolutionary changes in sensibility, as somehow unimportant because they don't coincide with the theory, or as what?
Oh, not unimportant, but just one of the domains that we shouldn't look to evolutionary biology to explain. So I completely agree with you. Evolutionary biology is not going to explain every taste, every historical movement. It's going to explain, one hopes, the basic human desires, the recurring things, not the local historical developments,
yes, but
which are just as interesting.
Yes, certainly that in these basic recurrences. But what I'm trying to claim is that the things that we really find most interesting about our cultural developments, the marks which we regard as fascinating about, say, European culture of the last 1,500 years, are those very things for which, in fact, there isn't really a biological explanation, where, in fact, a cultural explanation is the only adequate one.
So it's cut itself off completely from natural selection, from biological
explanation? Yes, I think it's got
nothing. There's no connection with it whatsoever.
Well,
is that what you're saying?
No,
that actually the music of Bach and the painting of Michelangelo got nothing whatsoever to do with natural selection.
I mean, Bach didn't score any notes that could be heard only by a bat. So that's a biological constraint. But I don't think you learn a lot about classical music from saying that. And it's on, you know.
On the other hand, yeah, I mean, it's interesting that it's always sort of pushed down, just to take the sort of, what is obviously around this table, rather devil's advocate position. Do you think that, Steven Pinker has something to say about that in his most recent book, do you think that the harmonies discovered, the notes discovered in music, have something to do with, I'm just asking you, you're the experts, have something to do with the way we have evolved, or are they cut off from the way we are involved? I mean, what it seems to me that is being said again and again is, look, natural selection, evolution, it might be all very well for all the rest of the lot, but for Homo sapiens, no, it doesn't really have anything to do with the things that really interest us, the culture. Is that what you seem to be saying again and again? Well, that's what you're saying.
Not at all. I mean, it's clearly the case that Steven Pinker's far more of an expert on this than I am, that the mechanics of the brain, the way we hear, and our perceptions of colour, are evolved phenomena which determine the very being of art. And I don't think anybody could possibly deny that. I just wonder how far you can go along with the argument if you take the idea that we all like constable landscapes. Well, we do, but we didn't evolve in a constable landscape. We evolved in a savanna, and we evolved at the end of the end of the ice age, a bloody cold savanna with lots of dust in the air. So it's the trouble is this over-explanation that goes on.
I think we bring Meredith Small in, who's been politely absent for the conversation for far too long.
There's just a wonderful story by primatologist Hal Bauer at Gombe Stream Reserve in Tanzania, where he decided to follow this male chimp day after day he would go out and, you know, just come back very late at night and then find the male again and follow him. And this male chimp would go to the waterfall at Gombe, sit down, sit there for a while, stare at the waterfall for some period, and then get up and walk away. There was no food there, he didn't drink water, nothing. And I always use that as an example of aesthetics in chimpanzees. So a biological basis for appreciating these things.
Well, what do you learn about Homo sapiens from the chimpanzees by comparison?
Perhaps that there is a biological basis for appreciation of beauty.
So actually you would develop this, how far would you develop this? Steven Pinker is beginning to develop it. How far would you develop it?
I think I would probably take it that far, that being able to appreciate something that gives you pleasure, maybe it has something to do with calming the body, enjoying a beautiful painting or music, maybe there's a benefit.
I mean, is there any sense in which cultures, Jonathan talks about the last 15 years of European culture, let's take that as an example, is part of something which could be seen in terms of survival and so, and no, not at all?
I'm not aware of any evidence in the strict sense of it being associated with survival. I mean, I don't think cultured people, like the people around in this room, have more children than uncultured people. So in that sense, it doesn't.
Yeah, I mean, I think you yourself put it well, that it's not that the particular musical pieces or the particular styles of painting have any biological relevance, but basic tastes such as harmonic intervals or landscapes as opposed to bus terminal waiting rooms may have a particular biological basis. And I want to get back to Jonathan's point that the most interesting things about human behavior are exactly those that evolutionary theory can't explain. I guess we're all interested in different things, and being humans and taking for granted the human psyche, of course we're interested in the differences, the difference between the English and the Scottish, the difference between post-1500 art and pre-1500 art. On the other hand, if you step back and you look at the human species and you say, why is the human species different from the best robot in existence? Why is a human species different from bonobos or chimps or parrots or flatworms? Then all of a sudden evolutionary theory does have a lot to say, and those are questions that are of interest to some of us.
I agree with you completely. The fact that we are, in fact, pictorially ingenious is something which, in fact, must have a purely biological explanation. The fact that we are doodlers and makers, vastly surplus to practical requirements, must have some sort of selective advantage.
Well, I'm glad to hear that, because I think that's what I was trying to say.
Well, this, I think, is what Steve and I agree with, and I'm sure that, that the other Steve also agrees with this, that there must be some sort of cognitive origin which is biologically determined. Our tendency to see causality and to experiment with causality is something which is hardwired into the brain. I often use the sort of the metaphor of our being these sort of infant astronauts that are soft-landed on this planet. It would be futile planning if we would not soft-landed with a whole set of hardwired repertoires which anticipated what this planet's got on it. And that's been selectively determined at a very early stage.
I feel like to dig hard to get there. I think I'm glad we've got to that point. Can we move on to the next section here? Steve Jones, do you think we're evolving in any way? We all know the story about the brain growing and growing and becoming the marvellous thing on display this evening. Thank you very much. Anyway, we all know it has grown this way, enabling us to do all these amazing things. Now, has it stopped?
It's very dangerous to make predictions about evolution, but I think the most remarkable thing about human evolution is how little of it there's been. If you compare the way we live with the way people lived 100 years ago or 100,000 years ago, it's quite an astonishing change. But I happen to live in Camden Town, and if a Cro-Magnon man got on the tube and sat next to me, I probably wouldn't notice. And yet his life is utterly different in every way from mine, and there's been remarkably little change in the strict biological sense in his or her structure compared to ours. So in some ways we stopped evolving in the sense which a snail-geneticist might recognize, say, a long, long time ago.
But we did, as has been pointed out again and again around this table this evening, we have evolved massively in cultural areas, and in a way, in certain areas, it has been suggested, unleashed ourselves from any demands that natural selection and evolution might have had. Now, that is a development.
Yes,
but
definitely.
You don't think that has done anything serious to the evolution of the brain?
Well, I mean, I think evolution needs fuel, and the fuel, roughly put, is inherited differences in the chances of having children. And you can put figures on that, which I won't bore you with. But at least in a Western society, recently, and that's a very narrow view, the chances of survival for a child born to reproductive age is something like 96, 97%. 100 years or 200 years ago, it was about 50%. And that 50% of the ones that died before they had children was the fuel of evolution. Now, the fuel's gone. There's no more firewood. So we can't evolve in that sense. We simply can't. It's physically impossible. However, as I say, this is an instant in evolutionary time, and it's one particular set of cultures. So it may well start again.
But again, you're talking about in Western industrialized countries, survival is 96%, where in third world countries, infant survival is 50%. So you can't say that. I think it's two different questions. Are humans evolving? Is natural selection still operating? Natural selection is obviously still operating. Some people live, some people die, some people reproduce, some don't. And again, we have to turn to those countries with higher reproductive rates. And my guess is that natural selection is having its greatest effect on the immune system. And those with the best immune systems, not the best brains, are the ones who are going to pass on genes.
Stephen Pinker, why why should I pass on that? Can you just tell us a bit more why you think that's the case?
Well, because disease is something that obviously wipes someone out before or maybe after reproductive age, wipes out children, and in massive ways. Plagues, we've all heard about the Ebola virus, HIV, and the death rate is huge in third world countries. Malaria is still a great killer in third world countries.
And the recent evidence shows that these diseases are coming back stronger and more virulent.
Coming back stronger. Tuberculosis
TB
is coming back. Cholera. And as I said, infant survival is 50%. And yes, these are the countries where still the reproductive rate, even with infant death, 50%, are still increasing in population size, whereas in Western affluent countries, population.
You've written about the brain lots, has the brain reached its optimum size? Is there no way that it is ever going to get bigger? What could make it bigger? What could make it say, look, I've got to have a bit more?
Yeah. Well, it's clear what's not going to make it bigger, and that's evolutionary inertia, which is alive in a lot of people's imagination. In science fiction, you often have a picture of what we're going to look like in 100,000 years. There are these bulbous-headed, bald, varicose-veined, spindly-bodied little homunculi. And that's the assumption, on the assumption that if you take all of the trends that have held for the last million years and extrapolate them, you'll see what our descendants look like. Now, that's not valid, and I think Steve makes a very important point in saying that what's going to determine how we evolve is simply going to be birth and death rates. The brain is evolved because it was a handy gadget. The question is further development going to bring benefits that exceed the costs? Maybe not. As Steve pointed out, it hasn't changed as far as we can tell in 30,000, perhaps 100,000 years. And indeed, the brain is a very costly organ. It's big. It bobs around at the end of this delicate little stalk. It's got to go through the pelvis of a woman during childbirth. It uses 20% of our nutrients, even though it takes up only 2% of our body mass. And so at least it's plausible that it's reached a kind of optimum of costs versus benefits, although we can't know for sure since we can't see what's going to happen in the next 100,000 years.
But death rate and birth rate may not be the only determinant of evolutionary success. That there may also be selective determinants of who is going to be allowed to have a birth rate. And one of the things that will happen in a culture of one sort rather than another are sexual advantages given to people who are mentally endowed in a certain way, which would favor them, in fact, having a chance to breed, given the fact that when they do breed, their offspring have a 96% chance of survival. The question is, who's going to have the biggest chance of having the 96% chance of survival? And that may be actually determined by cultural changes which will make certain people into, as it were, neuters, rather like at an ant's nest. Not because they are serving the others, but simply because they can't get mates because they're not interesting to the selecting females.
Can I come to you, Steve?
No, hang on, but I think this is. I mean, this is an issue. This, and I think that it's a. I mean, we tend to look at it as if it's purely quantitative question of birth and death and the survival, but it may be a question of who is selected and allowed to breed, and that may have a very profound evolutionary outcome.
I mean, evolution's an examination with 2 papers, and I passed the first one. I am a lie, at least I hope I am, but I failed the second one because I have no children. And that's always been the case, and it's much harder to mark the second paper because most of the male candidates have left by the time the results come through. And we tend to forget that. But again, if you look at differences in reproductive rate, in some societies there were quite fantastic differences. The person I'm aware of with the most children of all, I think it's mentioned in your book actually, is our friend Moulay Ismail the Cruel of Morocco. Clearly not a very nice man. He had 888 children because he was able to monopolize the females in his court. And so for every one Moulay Ismail, there was plenty of Fred Smith's The Glum of Morocco who had no children at all. And that too has gone away. The variation in reproductive success has dropped. Not just the variation in staying alive or dying, it's the variation in the number of children. So evolution really has slowing down or stopped in the West for now.
Can I come back to something you said about Cro-Magnon man sitting next to you on the underground in Camden Town? I'm sure a lot of your neighbours will be around to have a chat with you tomorrow morning. But do you think that there's a sense in which the evolution, any evolution that's taken place since what people call the Stone Age, has brought about particular mental problems, has brought about particular mental stresses which are unique to the part of time that we're in?
There have been various claims of this kind. I'm not sure the evidence is that good. I mean, I'm not one of the... I mean, there has been a foolish tendency with people of vaguely pinko tone, amongst whom I count myself, to deny the fact that evolution could affect the brain. Well, that's just silly. There are 60,000 or so working genes in a human being, and half of them are switched on at any time in the brain. In the red blood cells, only 66 are. So clearly there are many, many genetic changes in the brain which are open to natural selection. And I think most people who are in long-term mental hospitals are there for genetic reasons. They have inherited severe mental diseases. Beyond that, though, I'm not quite sure that I would be able to pinpoint anything where natural selection is working directly on single behavioural genes, but Steven Pinker, I'm sure would know much better than I do.
Well, I would agree. One could, though, make the argument that some forms of dysfunction are due to a mismatch between the environment that we live in now and the environment in which we evolved. So when you see figures that 30% of people have dyslexia, that can't mean that 30% of people have some neurological disease, as it's sometimes claimed, but rather we evolved in an environment without written language. It's an evolutionary novelty, only maybe 5,000 years old in some parts of the world. And one could say that the brain isn't adapted to written language in the same way that it's adapted to spoken language. And if there's a high percentage of people who don't master it very well, that's just is a reflection of our evolutionary heritage. There may be other syndromes that also can be analysed in terms of this mismatch.
Yes, well, this is behind the question I was asking Meredith Small, that the distance travelled, the amount of accomplishments that people have to have nowadays, will increasingly have to have just to get through the day, is a long way from primates.
But let's keep in mind that for almost all of us, we're riding on the backs of a few people who invent wonderful things. Most of us use computers, but we didn't invent them, and we don't know how they work. So not everyone has all the smarts. There are some people who have more than others in terms of figuring out things like computers and cars and telephones and whatever.
I suppose partly what I'm asking is there anything unique about the cluster of information and the scramble for success that was going on, and we are told by economists and some biologists is becoming more and more extreme? Is there anything that is pressing on people's minds in what could be called a unique way and making things happen to humankind which it weren't forced to happen before?
I think our groupings are not the sort of groupings for which we were selected in the savannah. Very small groupings, very small bondings and alliances were required in order to keep the social groups coherent and successful and reproductively successful on the savannah. And with that cognitive and emotional apparatus, we're thrown into a vast maelstrom, not of information, but of requirements, interpersonal requirements, of many anonymous strangers who put demands upon us, of expectations of prestige from people we don't know, people we partly know, expectations of achievement and so forth, in a social setting which is infinitely more complicated than the one for which we were selected. And I think that many of the so-called mental disorders that arise, some of which, of course, are quite clearly genetically determined, things like schizophrenia and the bipolar disorders. But the vast mass of things for which people seek psychotherapeutic help, I'm sure, are determined by some sort of strain introduced into a mind which was undoubtedly selected for very small and relatively simple communities.
Yeah, I mean, that's true. I mean, the number 12 is a famous one. I mean, there are 12 people on a very sort of nearly 12, 11, 12 or 15 people on various kinds of team games. You can't imagine a game of football with 1,000 people on either side. And you know, Jesus didn't have 2 disciples and 12 people on a jury. So there may be some kind of statement there about the size of the group we evolved towards. But we happen to live, all of us, I think, in large cities. I mean, there are 8 million people in London, and I don't find myself too crowded, even on the tube. So I think, really, it's rather limited what you can say in this, using this evolutionary language.
Does evolutionary theory tell us anything about individual human behavior, do you think, Stephen Pinker?
Well, to the extent that each one of us is recognizably human and not a bonobo, not a gorilla, not a robot, an artificial intelligence program, yes. To the extent that we differ from one another, it's less clear. Natural selection is a force that homogenizes. If there's a selection pressure, then what it will tend to do is reduce variability in a given population. The variability that remains has a number of possible causes, but one of them is just random genetic variation that doesn't have any adaptive value in it itself. So if you're interested in the difference between John and Bill or Mary and Sally, it's quite possible that evolutionary theory doesn't have anything to say. There's some ways in which it might, but it may not also.
I mean, does evolutionary theory have anything to say about altruism or tenderness or morality?
Sure, but at a group level, a population level, rather than an individual level, not why is John or Mary an altruist, but why are people sometimes altruistic? You can ask it at that level.
And you think there's an evolutionary answer to that?
No, not really. Everyone always says humans are the only species that are altruistic, but if you look at the cases of altruism, they're incredibly rare. The man jumping into the river to save people after a plane crash, that's why they're in the news, because they're incredibly rare. And usually when people are altruistic at some level, they're receiving something back. So it's not true altruism, even if it's the emotional satisfaction of helping someone out.
And evolutionary theory and natural selection has nothing to tell us about morality, you think?
I think it probably does. Frans de Waal has written at great length about the biological basis of morality, suggesting again that chimpanzees, other primates, other social animals have the same systems that we do in terms of justice and empathy, and that there may be a biological basis for right and wrong, knowing right and wrong, and punishment for wrong, and rewarding right behavior in a social situation.
I get very worried about the use of words like morality in a biological context. I mean, the thing is about morality is how do you measure it? How do you measure the morality of a fruit fly or a snail or a chimp? It's not easy. It's a human
But do we have
construct.
to measure the morality of a fruit fly?
Yes, if you're going to use biological arguments, you have to measure how much there is here, how much there is there, and what circumstances it's found. Samuel Taylor Coleridge used to go to lectures on chemistry in the Royal Institution, and when he was asked why he put himself through this torment, he said, to improve my stock of metaphors. And there's a real danger of just using this metaphorical language to explain animal behavior, human behavior in animal terms. It's just silly, it doesn't make sense.
But are you saying
there must be some sort of tendency. I mean, it would be very odd if there weren't some sort of antecedents. I mean, the fact is that we seek antecedents for the structure of our hearts, we seek antecedents for the structure of our nasal septum, and for the fact that we have a skull of the full sort that we did. It would be very odd if there were not behavioral antecedents for the things that we approve in ourselves, such as morality. We don't have to therefore call it morality when we see it in chimpanzees. What we see are tendencies to form alliances, tendency to scratch backs in return for having one's back scratched, which is elevated into something which has elaborate moral discourse attached to it. It would be very odd if there weren't some sort of antecedent.
Just being social animals, any social animal means there's going to be competition no matter what, and there have to be ways to reconcile that competition to stay social, to stay in a group.
Yes. I mean, our interest and the child's interest in its mother's face is part and parcel of something which actually can be seen to be part of the cement of social life. It's something which it inherits from its primate ancestors. How could it be otherwise? We are the creatures of our ancestry. We have descended with modification, and therefore there must be things to have been modified. It would be absolutely fatuous to deny that.
Stephen Pinker.
Well, I think there is a sensible biological analysis of the moral sense, which is different from a biological analysis of morality itself. But it can be measured. The technical definition of altruism in biology is conferring a benefit at a cost to oneself. There is a prediction that altruism among non-relatives should generally evolve only when it's accompanied by certain psychological apparatus, such as the ability to recognize individuals, the ability to hold grudges, the ability to mete out punishments or rewards commensurate with how you've been treated in the past. And in species that have altruism in this technical sense, indeed, you find memory for individuals, you find memory for their deeds, and you find behavior that looks as if it's holding a grudge. And of course, you find it in humans. That behavior in us is associated with the emotions that we label with things like guilt, anger, sympathy, gratitude, and so on. The question of whether other animals have those same emotions, I agree, can't be answered just by observation. But if you look at the evidence as to whether there are enough points of similarity, enough homology, enough evidence for homology, then I think one can make a sensible argument. For example, are there the same hormonal states when a human feels guilty and when an animal does something that one might be tempted to call guilt? Are there the same facial expressions? Do the same parts of the brain light up? I don't know what the answers to these questions are, but I think it is a studyable problem.
So finally, do you think, are we free to override biology?
Well, we're free to override a lot of biology except for being born and dying and eating and going to the bathroom and sleeping. I think we have to stick with those, though, no matter what.
But all the in-between bits?
I think so, yes.
Free in what sense, Stephen Pinker?
Well, my question is, who's we? Certainly, one part of us can override most other parts, but that part of us, the decision maker, the little man in control in the head, is itself a part of our biology. So I'd say one part of our biology can overcome another, but I'm uncomfortable with the idea of the free-floating me hovering above the brain, somehow pulling the levers of behavior.
Well, I think the fact that in the long run we're all dead tells us that we're not free to overcome the constraints of biology, but we know that, and I think we just have to accept it and make sure that biology doesn't rule what left we have of our lives.
And Jonathan Miller?
Well, I'm holding in my hand an example of overriding biology. We're sitting around an example of one, and I'm looking at my wrist, which is an example of overriding biology. In that sense, we have overridden it in the ways which we find interesting about ourselves. I'm wearing an overriding of biology.
Well, and I'm looking at an overriding of biology, and I'm afraid we're out of time. And my thanks to Stephen Pinker, Steve Jones, Meredith Small, and Jonathan Miller. Good night.
But I think that, as Steve was saying, I think there probably is not much more to it than that we can say. What is interesting are the enormous varieties of human behavior which lie outside these biases. I mean, there must be some sort of bias which is genetically determined, which means that we still go on having sex. But also what is interesting about us is the enormous variety of our sexual conduct, which really has no effect on the amount of genes that we push into the next generation and beyond.
Steve?
I think that Steve wasn't quite being fair in saying that this is all just obvious and we don't need evolution to tell us this. It's obvious now because of the evolutionary theory that had become well known 20 years ago. But up till then, and indeed today, at present times, there are many people who say that men's desire for a variety of sexual partners is just due to the influence of James Bond and is a culturally local phenomenon and wouldn't be found in other cultures, which turns out to be false. Many people would say that with the feminist revolution that asymmetry will vanish, and recent studies have shown that it has not vanished. Similarly, the study of the correlation between tastes for sexually attractive bodies and fertility would not have been dreamed of without the Darwinian analysis. Even a few years ago, people would have said, well, you can't quantify beauty. It varies capriciously from culture to culture, and it has nothing to do with biology.
Can I bring in Meredith Small here, because something that Steven Pinker said on the way through implied that men were necessarily more promiscuous than women, and in your book, insofar as I read it correctly, that's one of the points you take on, don't you?
Yes, work by Robin Baker has highlighted several biological features of women that suggest that women may be designed to be interested in multiple partners. And we can't just say this is a provenience of males, and it may be the heavy hand of culture that stops women, and in various cultures, from having multiple partners. And again, what women say they like or say what they're doing and what they're really doing are two different things.
What do you think about this basic? Is there a basic difference?
Well, there must be some sort of biological bias. I mean, it's like the bias that exists in a bowl. And there are these genes which constitute the bias, and they turn things in certain directions. And the directions you've mentioned, and the particular sort of partners that are favoured. The fact that sexual activity is undertaken at all with the sort of energy and expenditure that it is indicates that it must be biologically determined in some way.
Well, is it biologically determined? Because what Meredith Small has been saying is, look, this is culturally determined. Women have been given a subservient role in many cultures, and they've even been given a subservient role, if you forgive the pun, in sex.
Why do we have to be exclusive about it? I mean, the whole point of it is that we are, in fact, these amphibious creatures distributed halfway between a culture, which is best described in cultural terms, and our genetic inheritance, which is best described in genetic terms. But it somehow always...
Not necessarily the other way around. We did evolve, of course we evolved, and our lives are constrained by our past. But to say that actually isn't to say much more than to say that the reason pigs can't fly is that they descended from ancestors who didn't have wings. Now that's true, but it's not a very profound thing to say. And I do think there's been a terrible tendency in this debate about sexuality and many other things to overinterpret the obvious. So I think we should realize that we're unique in that although we have evolved, what's interesting about us has really stepped outside Darwin's theory. We've escaped from evolution in sex and many other things too.
Meredith Small.
Well, I'd just like to add that what humans do and what they say are two different things. So men may desire younger women, but in fact research shows that couples are made up of individuals that are about 3 years apart. Women may want men of high status or a lot of money, but pretty much we end up with who loves us or who wants us. So the desires can be very different from the actual fact of who you reproduce with.
Jonathan Miller.
And social class might also have something to do with it. I mean, it's quite clear that there must be some evolutionary explanation for the fact that pleasure is attached to this activity for which one otherwise might have to put an entry in one's diary to remind one to do it. And whenever pleasure is attached to a labour-intensive activity, it must be that there must at one time have been a selective advantage in doing it, and therefore some sort of selective advantage in attaching pleasure to it.
Good evening and welcome to the Linnaean Society, where Darwin's revolutionary paper on natural selection was read for the first time. The occasion passed without much notice. Well, the BBC has certainly remedied that. Tonight we examine what Darwin's theories tell us about ourselves. I'm joined by an international panel of pinnacles of evolution. Professor Steven Pinker, psychologist from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Professor Meredith Small, anthropologist from Cornell University. Professor Steve Jones, biologist from University College London, and Dr. Jonathan Miller, neurologist and polymath. The issue tonight is, to what extent are we still under the shadow of natural selection? We're not concentrating on grand theories, but how far does evolution make its way into everyday life? Evolution is about success in reproduction and survival, so let's start with human reproduction. To what extent are our sexual desires determined by our evolutionary inheritance? Steven Pinker.
Well, I don't think people have sex for evolutionary reasons. They're not interested in propagating their genes. If they were, there'd be no such thing as contraception. On the other hand, if you ask the question, why is there sexual desire to begin with? Why do people get pleasure out of sex? I think evolution has everything to do with it. The fact that people would rather have sex than, say, bump foreheads or rub an elbow against a knee surely is related to the fact that sex leads to reproduction, whereas those other activities don't. More subtly, I think there are a number of features of sexuality that can be explained on the assumption that it is a way of sending genes into the next generation. The fact that people are attracted to other people who look as if they're fertile, who have the right body shape and size and the right age. The fact that there
So
are...
is it men attracted to, from your book, men attracted to a particular sort of women and vice versa?
And the difference between the sexes. In all societies, male sexuality and female sexuality are not equivalent. Roughly speaking, men have more of a tendency to go for quantity, women for quality, and it's surely no coincidence that a man who has sex with 50 women can have 50 times as many children. A woman who has sex with 50 men is not going to have 50 times as many children. So that biological fact and that behavioral fact presumably are related, and that's an example of how evolutionary theory helps explain some of the patterns of human sexual desire.
Would you go along with that, Steve?
Yes, I think so far so self-evident, really. I mean, I don't think we need Charles Darwin to tell us that old men need like young women and not